let's go ahead and get started here. I think we've had plenty of chance to shout out our locations and do all that fun stuff. So howdy, everybody. Welcome again. My name is Mike Geig, and I'm on the advocacy team here at Unity. And so sorry, the chat's just going nuts and it's super distracting my vision here. I'm Mike Geig. I'm on the advocacy team here at Unity. Before we get started, just want to do a quick overview of Accelerate Success content series. This is a technical series consisting of webinars and ebooks written by developers from our Accelerate Solutions team. Now, if you don't know what the Accelerate Solutions team is, the Accelerate Solutions team is our professional services group that offers consulting, co-development, and full development to our customers. They often take on some of the most complex and challenging Unity work where our customers are really pushing the boundaries of what Unity can do. If you'd like to learn more about Accelerate Solutions and the kind of work they do, my colleague will drop a URL in the chat there. Oh, that was quite timely. Well done. All right, so a few housekeeping details before we get started. This presentation is going to last about 40 minutes with roughly 15 minutes for questions and answers at the end. Go ahead and please post your questions in the Q&A section, not necessarily in chat, and we'll get to as many of them as we can in the last 15 minutes. Remember to post it in the Q&A section, not the chat section. Chat tends to go real fast and we might miss stuff there. So with that being said, I would like to introduce our presenter for today. This here is Ryan, waving. Hi, Ryan. Today's session will be held or led by Ryan Warner, who is a senior software development consultant at Unity. Ryan joined Unity in 2021 on the Accelerate Solutions team, where he spends his days helping developers optimize their experiences. And who doesn't love optimization? As an amateur photographer, he was drawn to the physically based tools in HDRP, which mimic the tools he uses in his hobbies. So with that, I'm going to hand everything over here to Ryan to kick off the session on achieving cinematic lighting in HDRP. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you everyone for coming. I'm happy that you're here today so we can take a look at some of my favorite parts of HDRP. So I just want to call out before we get started, this character displays a shader error. That's on purpose. We're going to correct that as we go through this presentation. It'll be one of the first things that we take a look at, actually. This scene was built with Unity 2021 LTS using the latest version of HDRP available for it. We're going to be looking at the physically based lighting and camera properties. We're going to be upgrading this character from the built-in rendering pipeline. We're going to build out a post-processing stack to give this a nighttime feel, a spooky vibe. We're going to examine reflection probes, light probe volumes, and we're going to have some time for Q&A afterwards. So the first thing before we correct that character controller is that I wanted to call out some of the samples that we're going to be using. This is built using the HDRP minimal template sample without the character controller, without any of the scenes that come with it. However, it is using some of the samples that come with HDRP, particularly the additional post-processing data is important, as well as the lens flare samples. We're going to show how that's used a little bit later on. And I'll also call out some of the asset store content that we're using for this. We'll share links in the chat afterwards so you could get these assets for yourself. But the background of the scene is Rocky Desert by Quad Art. The gas station is American Gas Station by Gabbro Media. The car here up front is from the 7 Carves pack by Lyco Show 3D. These trees in the background are from the Unity produced 3D game kit sample from a few years ago. And this character controller here that we have is from the sample pack that was produced, I believe, in 2020. So we'll just very quickly correct this. The easiest way to do that is to go into Edit, Rendering, Materials, and convert all built-in materials to HDRP. However, a word of warning, if you have a lot of built-in rendering pipeline content in your project, this will take quite a lot of time. So in that scenario, you may wish to find the specific materials you need to convert and convert the selected built-in materials. But because I only have the character controller in this case, I'm going to convert them all. So I click that menu item and then I click on proceed. And what this will do is go through all of the materials in the project that are using the built-in standard and standard specular shader setups. It will create mask maps for all of those based on the properties that have been filled in the materials. The mask map is the metallic and ambient occlusion data, as well as some additional data that you can generate for yourself in a tool such as Adobe Photoshop or something along those lines. It uses the various different channels of the image to bake that data in. So now that the wizard is completed, we can see that this character now looks correct and properly textured. The other thing that it does is goes through and resets from the standard shader and standard specular shader setups to the HDRP lit shaders.
Hey, Ryan.
Yes.
Real quick, would you mind moving the zoom share screen controls from the bottom there? Because they're just a little distracting. Are you able to move into a different monitor or something?
Oh, I don't have an additional.
Okay, well then, no worries. Just was calling it out. Apologies.
No problem. Put it in the bottom right-hand corner here. So now that our character is, a little bit better looking, I'm just going to call out that the visual targets that we're looking for is something along the lines of either Blade Runner or the recent movie Color of Space. So this is going to be a nighttime scene. It's going to have a sort of dark, purpley, spooky hue to it. As you can see right now, it kind of looks like a really washed out daytime scene. I can go and demonstrate what the typical default look dev that you'll get when you're working with HDRP is. By default, you're going to have like a really bright sunny day. And there are some easy ways that we can make this look like a nighttime scene. So I'm going to disable that. And the first thing that I'm going to do in my hierarchy is create a new container to store all of my nighttime lights and post-processing profiles. So I'll right-click on the hierarchy, create a new game object and call it night. Within there, I'm going to add a directional light. So I do that by right-clicking, going to light, and selecting directional light. As you can see, though, this is a daytime sunlight type setting. We're going to adjust that, but before we do, we're also going to turn on shadows. As you can see now, we're looking like the same washed out problem that we had before. That's because the sun is on the horizon, so it's casting everything perpendicular. So what we need to do is adjust the X and Y rotations of the directional light to make it sort of point in a direction that we can see things. So I'm going to increase rotation to about there, and then I'm going to rotate the Y, which spins it around the center to get it from the back. So you can see it projecting light and shadows onto the rest of the scene. So I think that that's pretty good. As we reduce and increase, we can see the effect the X rotation has on it. But the problem that we now have is that this light is very intense and it still looks like daylight. So HDRP uses physically based lighting. What that means is all of the values are based on real world values, such as the sun at midday, which is the default light. We have two options. We can manually set this value to something more appropriate. You can pull these values out of Wikipedia. If you just go and look up exposure, that will tell you the lux produced by the sun or the moon in various different conditions. You also have the opportunity to use this quick select setting where we can set it to a variety of different values. I'm going to set it to moon, but as you can see, that's still not very intense. So if we set it to actually about 3, I think that tends to work pretty well, but we're still not seeing very much light showing. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is that we don't have an exposure set, and we don't have a sky and physical environment set. So the way that we do that is we right click and we go down to volume and we create a sky and fog global volume. what this does is it creates a scene or a game object with a volume component attached, and it creates the sky and fog volume settings file, post-processing profile for us. This is the same thing as if we were to create a regular global volume, and we're going to do that here now too, because I like to split the lighting and environmental post-processing choices away from our aesthetic choices. So as we can see now, we also have the sun showing up in the sky. And it still looks like a sun. And it is now casting shadows as we expect it to. So I'm going to reduce that again to 0.5. We can still see it is casting shadows like we want it to, but it's still very orange in hue. So we're going to change the temperature over to a more blue cast, and that makes it look much, much more like a moon type light for us. You can also see that it's very washed out and very diffuse. There's a couple of reasons for that. The first is we can control the fall off and the angular diameter of the moon. So the fall off controls how much blur is around it. We're going to set that back to 4. That's a much, much higher value than I would want it to be. And we can control the angular diameter. That controls the actual size of the disk. So if you wanted a gigantic moon, super moon, or something like that, I tend to stick towards 4 for a gigantic but not impossibly sized moon. Another option you have to control the light a little bit better is you can change the light appearance. I tend to stick to filter and temperature because it's more realistic to the real world. But if you set color, you can directly influence the color of the light source. And this works both for directional lights and for all other lights in Unity. So you can have a very artistic effect if, for example, your game was set orbiting a red giant or a blue star or something like that. But I'm going to use filter and temperature. So the filter still works the same way. I'm going to set that back to white so it's not, so only the color temperature is affecting the light output. So as you can see now, we are much more close to a nighttime scene. You can see I've added some lights ahead of schedule just to, make the content of the scene a little bit more visible. And I'm just going to quickly refer to my notes here for a second. So the next thing I'm going to look at is the sky and fog volume. And the first thing that I'm going to add is an exposure override. Exposure allows you to control how much light is being observed by the camera. This can be controlled in a variety of different ways, from a fixed exposure, which is what I'm going to be demonstrating, to an automatic, a histogram, or a physically based camera exposure mode. If you enable the fixed exposure value, you can control how much light is in. A higher value means less light. A lower value means more light. I'm going to set that to 0 for a nighttime scene. And exposure compensation, again, allows you to control how much light affects the camera. For the purposes of this, I'm going to leave that to 0 as well. That's just an option for you to control how much light is in your scene. Physically based sky is the component that allows Unity to render the celestial body in the sky based off the directional light. You have other options to control your sky. You can use a cube map. You can use an HDRI image to add a really detailed sky, such as like very far distant buildings in the background or clouds or that kind of thing. But physically based sky gives us the ability to dynamically change the position of the celestial body in the sky. So we do that by rotating the X and the Y of the light. You can rotate the Z. It will twist the light. And if you're using a cookie, this is something that you might want to do. A cookie is a texture projected from the light. And that will allow you to change the rotation of it, but that's not something that we're going to be doing for this demo. Going back to our sky and fog volume, I mentioned why you might want to use an HDRI image would be to have some clouds in the background or some buildings. While this will not allow us to add buildings to the background, Unity 2021 HDRP recently introduced volumetric clouds. So we can add an override, and type in volumetric and get volumetric clouds. I'm going to change the view here so we can see a little bit more in the sky. All we need to do is click enable and enable the enable property. And now you can see that we have volumetric clouds in the background. We are going to enable the cloud control, and we're going to enable the cloud preset. So as you can see, the cloudy preset is it is cloudy, but it does still look like a nice sunny day. Sparse. There are very few clouds in the sky. They're very far in between. So if you're creating a plains type environment, in this case, I'm going to use stormy to give a pretty dramatic effect on the clouds. But you can see that these clouds are now occluding our celestial body. So I'm going to enable a shape offset and move the Y rotation to control where these clouds are in the sky. So I just want to rotate this to something that I like. I think that looks pretty okay. So we can still see the moon in the background. But I'm also going to want to add some animation to these clouds. So I'm going to check off global horizontal wind and orientation. I'm going to set this mode to additive, and I'm on both cases. However, by default, you're not going to actually see this effect. So you need to, in your editor, select this dropdown and set always refresh to true. This will now animate things in the background. So if we now set the global horizontal wind to 1,000, we'll see it's moving very, very quickly. And we can control the orientation to determine the direction that these clouds move. So I'm going to, yeah, I think that looks pretty good. We can go back to our game mode too. Well, if we go back to our game mode, we can see that because we're not actually in play mode, these clouds aren't animating. So, but this is what we will see in play mode when we have it run. So 10,000 is much, much too fast. I'm going to set that to 100. And I think that that's a much more reasonable weight. I'm going to change the orientation a little bit. Higher. That's okay. So now it's moving pretty slowly, but still moving a bit. So I'm going to turn off always refresh because there is an associated performance cost with that. I'm pretty satisfied with how these volumetric clouds are looking now. The next thing I'm going to look at is the fog. And this is the volumetric fog in the scene. It's not very pronounced right now. That's because the fog attenuation distance is set very high. This is a suitable value, 400, for a daytime scene where you want very far distant fog on the horizon interacting with the light. But for a nighttime scene, I'm going to set this down to 64. You can see immediately the effect that this has on our lights by brightening up the volumetric nature of these spotlights. But this is not really showing up on our directional light. So if we click on our directional light, we have a volumetrics section with a multiplier slider. If we increase this all the way, we can see exactly how this is affecting the scene. It turns everything very gray, and most importantly, we can see how the moon is now casting volumetric lights, volumetric shadows with these plants. We can see these very subtle shadow lines when we move the camera. But this is a very strong effect right now. I'm going to bring this down probably to, I think 3 is a decent level there. So I think that the settings that we have for our environment are pretty good. Next, I'm going to move on to building out our global post-processing profile. So when we created the global volume earlier, it created a game object with the volume component added, but it didn't create a volume profile for us. I've already created a number of volume profiles, but we're going to be doing this from scratch. So the easiest way to do that is to click the new button, and that will automatically assign that to this component for us. And we can just start adding overrides. I like to start with the most dramatic effect and then work down to simpler effects, more subtle effects as we go. So the first thing that I'm going to add is going to be blue. By default, none of the settings are enabled and it doesn't show up. So the first thing we do is enable intensity and crank it all the way to the right. As you can see, this has a really dramatic effect on how blurry the screen has become. What we want is this to only appear on the lights. To control that, we enable threshold and we start to increase the value. So as we can see, 3 is much too high and it really only appears on, when we have it at 3, it'll only appear on our moon. 1 tends to be a fairly decent level. As you can see, it's showing up on these neon lights and on the things in the background. If we go lower than that, it starts to affect the non-light parts of the image. So I'm going to set that to 1, and I'm going to be pretty happy with that. The next really important thing that you can do with Bloom is to add lens dirt. When I mentioned it earlier, the samples, the additional post-processing data, that's where this texture comes from. So we enable texture, and then we click on this circle over here to search for texture. And then we're going to type in dirt. These 4 lens dirt textures come from that sample pack, and there are a variety of other textures we're going to be using in this sample. I tend to like lens dirt 00, but again, as you can see, we can't actually see it. So I'm going to set this to 100 to demonstrate exactly what the effect is we're getting. It's all of these little splotches we see on our camera. These tend to only show up in brightly colored portions of the screen. If we look to the darker areas, we can see there aren't really any splashes. So if we go back here, we can see much more like what we'll see in brightly lit sections. 100 is much too intense a value. I'm going to set this down to 10. And for some, that's still a really intense amount of lens dirt. But you can, tune that to what you find to be more important just by adjusting that intensity value. I'll also show the other lens dirts. So lens dirt 00 is the one I tend to prefer. 01 is quite subtle. 02 has a little bit more, and 03 is again quite subtle. But I like 00 for those bokeh circles that we see. The next effect that I'm going to add is chromatic aberration. Chromatic aberration is the color fringing you see in high contrast portions of an image. So if we again enable the intensity and crank it all the way to the right-hand side, you can see exactly what I'm talking about. This fringing, this multicolored fringing on the edges of the screen, wherever there's high contrast, and it appears in a variety of different colors. Those colors are controlled by this spectral LUT texture, which also comes from the additional post-processing data samples. We click on the search circle, and we type in LUT, and we can see it comes with 4 that you can choose, and they control exactly the colors as we go through the fringe. So this one's blue-red, we have green-purple, we have purple-green, and we have red-blue. The one I tend to go for is purple-green. But again, as you can see, this effect is much too intense for any real world purposes. So you're going to want to dial that back from full on 1. That's probably a little high right there, I think. So 0.125 is a pretty good value. So that's starting to look like something. The next effect that I'm going to add is vignetting. Vignetting is the darkening of the corners and the edges of an image. It's an artifact produced by camera lenses. So it's something that we have to recreate in video games because there's no imperfections on the color. We add vignetting. And again, we're going to turn on the intensity and increase it all the way to the right, to 1, to see exactly the effect that it's having. So you can see it has this darkening effect around the entire image. You have a variety of different ways that you can control that. The first thing I'm going to demonstrate is the smoothness. It starts out at 0.2 by reducing this all the way to 0.1. You can see a very hard edged, almost like an iris, like a camera's iris in the center. And if we increase this all the way to 1, we can see it's a very, very blurry, distorted image. So I tend to stick with the default value of 0.2. The roundness determines the overall oval or square shape of the vignette. If we go back to smoothness of 0, we can see the exact effect that has. Roundness is different from rounded. Rounded pushes the vignetting into the center of the frame, regardless of the aspect ratio. So if I enable that, I'll show you exactly what effect that has. And then if we turn the roundness all the way up, we actually see that it is a perfect circle here in the center of the frame. So in this case, I will not be using that. And I will be setting my roundness down to about 0.25 or so. And then I'm going to increase my smoothness to about the same. And now at this point, I'm going to back the intensity off until it's gone. And then I'm just going to enable and increase it until it starts to encroach on my image. That's a bit much. Yeah, so I think that that's pretty good, 0.5. I'm going to just enable it, disable it so you can get a better sense of the effect that it has. It's subtle, but when it's removed, it is much more obvious how it affects things. The next thing that I'm going to add is depth of field, which is a bit of a different topic. So for this, I'm going to switch to the game tab. Depth of field does not show up in our scene view. So I'm going to now add depth of field to our post-processing stack. By default, it is off. We have several modes under which we can control it. I'll first demonstrate manual ranges. And you can see the immediate effect this has on the scene. It blurs it simulates the focal plane of a lens, which is the area that is in focus as it shows on the camera sensor. You can control the start and the end. So we're not going to bother with the start, but if we expand the end, we can see that things in the foreground become blurry. And if we bring it in, they become in focus. So by default, 4 is 4 meters away from the camera. So we can see the very near foreground is blurred. And yeah, so that's how that works. The start and end control the background blur. So if we push out the end, we can see that the gasoline sign comes into focus. And if we bring that back down to 10, it becomes blurry. And the end is where that blurring stops and becomes totally blurred. So this allows us to control the gradient of blurriness in the background. But because HDRP is physically based, we can set this to physical camera and have a different way entirely of controlling this. However, what this requires is that we work with our camera system to control these images. So we have to go into our main camera and ensure that physical camera is enabled. This enables several of these options here that we can then control from our Cinemachine virtual cameras. If you're not using Cinemachine, you don't need to control these from the virtual cameras. You can control them directly from this game object. But in this case, for this demo, we are using it. So now we go into the CM VCam1 object, which is just an object created through game object, Cinemachine virtual camera that I have done before. And we have the lens and physical properties area. So we have several ways that we can control this. The aperture determines how much light is allowed into the camera, as well as the depth of field, the actual distance of the in focus area. So if we increase the value, the area is much larger. And if we decrease the value, the area is much smaller. We can also control the ISO, which controls the amount of light, as well as the shutter speed, which is really not so much important in this particular demo, but it does come into play when we're looking at motion blur, and the anamorphism. Anamorphism is a effect that converts background blur highlights from circles to ovals. Setting it all the way over to the left, as I have set it here, makes them horizontal, and setting them to the right makes them vertical. So as you can see, by switching this to the right, these background blurs on the lights are now showing up vertically. If we set it to 0, they are circles. And if we set it to -1, they are horizontal ovals. We're going to use horizontal ovals. I'm going to rotate the sun to a little bit more of a visible there. The moon, so you can see it there a little bit better. Yeah. So you can see that affects the moon as well. To demonstrate the moon, I'm just going to quickly disable our volumetric clouds, because there's another feature that I wanted to demonstrate with HDRP that I actually, unfortunately, I missed demonstrating here. This is one of the newer features in HDRP. It's the HDRP lens flare. The lens flare data is used to control the lens flare. So this is the effect of showing of an aberration of light on the lens. We can click on the search button and it prompts us with the lens flare data assets, and we can just select one from the menu. Again, this is from the samples kit as we used before. So we can just quickly iterate through to show what effect that has on the light. I'm going to go for a anamorphic sci-fi lens flare. We can control the intensity of the flare, make it overwhelming, make it somewhat subtle, and we can control the scale. That's the vertical scale. So I'm going to select that, and I think that I'm okay with that there. I'm going to come back into the spline fog volume and re-enable volumetric clouds. That's somewhat intense. That's still lets us see the clouds and still shows the lens flare there. I'm okay with how that looks. The other thing that we need to look at in our main camera is our sensor size. This is set to a 16mm sensor type, which is a common format used in television production and earlier movies. You can also set it to 35mm Academy, which this has an effect on our focal length and our depth of field. The larger the sensor size, the wider the image and the shallower the depth of field is. So if we select 70mm IMAX, we'll see that it's zoomed in further. And then we can control the focal length in our Cinemachine virtual camera here. So this corresponds to real world lens focal lengths. So if, for example, we have a 120mm lens, well, it's a 1200mm lens, we can see that that is much more zoomed in or maybe 5mm lens. 50 is a very common street photography lens focal length. 35 is what we'll be using for this more pulled back, wider angle. Right, so I'm okay with how that's looking for our depth of field. We can also control the focus distance to demonstrate. And so this is where, if you were using a camera, like the distance that you're focusing in on your subject. So I'm just using my eye to just make sure this player character is in focus. And I think that 0.6 focal length is good. But as you can see, if we bring that in closer, it makes the background more blurry, or we can control the distance and make it further. So I'm going to set this back to 6. I think that looks pretty good. So those are the major effects on our overall image. Now I'm going to start doing some color adjustments. I'm going to add an override. The first thing I'm going to add is white balance, which allows us to control the overall temperature and tint of the image as an overlay, as a gel, as it were, on the lens rather than specific lights. So if we control the temperature, we can set it all the way to the left to make it very blue, or all the way to the right to make it very orange. I'm going to, because this is a night scene, sort of move this over here. -26 gives us a nice blue cast. Tint allows us to control the yellow and purple, or the green and purple. If you want a very alien style thing, you can go that way. I'm going to make this, 22, I think, gives us a nice purple cast. So if we now disable that, we can see it's a fairly subtle effect, but that's what we're going for. The next effect that I like to add is split toning. So again, split toning is the option for us to have like overlaid colors, both the shadows and the highlights, and to control specifically which parts of the image are showing these highlights. A very typical selection of colors used in split toning is the orange-blue contrast. You'll see this in Blade Runner 2049. Basically, every movie uses this, and it's very common in movie posters as well. So we're going to go blue in the shadows, and you can see how blue that makes the shadow. To control this a little bit better, we're going to set it to a more gray texture, or a more gray blue. Right there in the center, maybe lighter blue. Yeah, that gives us a little bit more color. I think that looks okay. And then we're going to enable it for highlights, and we're going to set that to a yellow orange. You can see the effect that it's having even at this brightness, but we're going to control the balance of this momentarily here. We enable balance. So if we slide this all the way over to the left, it only affects the shadows, and slide it all the way over to the right, it only affects the highlights. And now you can see that orange is shown through much more readily. I'm going to adjust this to maybe 30. So we have some opportunity for the orange to show through, but not have it overwhelming. And then we'll turn off split toning so we can see the effect that has. And then the next effect that I like to add is the color adjustments. Color adjustments allows us to control the overall exposure as over exposure compensation, but not directly in the lens. The contrast, we can add a filter, we can control the hue and the saturation. So the post-exposure makes the image much brighter. We're not going to actually use that in this case, so I'm going to turn that back off. Contrast allows you to make the image much more contrasty, or so lacking contrast that there is no image at all. I like to lower this a little bit. I think that looks okay. Hue allows us to control the overall color of the image. We have a very kaleidoscopic look this way. I tend to not use hue, but I do tend to adjust saturation. Saturation is the brightness of the colors of the image. If you really want to punch up the colors, you turn it all the way up. If you want to essentially a black and white image or a grayscale image. You turn it all the way down. I like to remove some color, but not a lot. And so when we turn this off, turn it back on, we can see the effect that that has. So this covers off the post-processing build for our scene. I'm going to switch back to the scene view and demonstrate baking of the lighting. So the baked lighting in HDRP uses reflection probes and light probes. But light probes have now been updated to have an experimental probe volume. This simplifies the placement of light probes in that it fills the scene with them for you. You simply right-click, go to light, and create probe volume experimental. You will need to turn that on in your HDRP default settings, but that is covered in the documentation as well as in the definitive guide to lighting for HDRP. So I will go back into the lighting panel here. I have mixed lighting. I have baked global illumination checked off. I have baked indirect lighting selected. That's the only version that's available for this particular project. And I'm using the GPU light mapper. It's really important to use the GPU light mapper if it's available to you, because it will dramatically speed up the baking process. This will only take a minute or two, and I'm going to click generate lighting right now. If you're going to use the CPU light mapper, it takes a considerable amount of time. It can take 7 hours to bake out the lighting for a scene. So certainly something you need to consider. If you don't have the hardware to do it, then so be it. You need at least 3 gigabytes of video memory to do it. I also have progressive updates and multiple importance selected. So that is currently baking up. Progressive updates, what we're going to see is as this bakes the global illumination, the bounce lighting, we'll start to see the scene update in real time. What we're going to see is green showing up from these lights on these various different plants. We'll see some orange show up here. And the other thing that this is going to do is bake out our reflection probes. And we'll demonstrate what effect that has back on the car over there. That car over there. So as you can see, it starts to look kind of weird. This is okay. This will be corrected as the ambient light is finalized. This is just one of the intermediary steps. And if progressive updates is not selected, you won't see that. It will just, it will not add the ambient lighting to the scene until after all of the light maps have been baked. But as you can see already, this has made a tremendous difference. We have a lot more light on our plant here. We can see that the light from this, where it was not being shown before at all, is now showing up. You can also see, so that's just it finalizing. So we can also see this purple hue has been cast inside this plant. And I don't know if your screen can show it, but it's also showing up on this plant as well. We also over here have the light from these crystals being cast onto the interior here. And if we go around to the front of our building, all of our neon lighting is now casting light onto the geometry of the scene. So this orange is reflected here, the yellow, or the green on the front door, and the green inside this building is showing up. We can also now see on this car, because we've baked our reflection probes, the reflection of the scene in the background. So we can see the gas sign, all of the lamppost and the gas pump. And yeah, so that's that. And now we can just run the project so we can see it working in real time. So I have this character connected, and we can see him moving around in our scene. And we can also disable the Cinemachine virtual camera and re-enable our player follow camera. And we can see now that that this is no longer tracking our character properly. So we need to, in this case, in our player follow camera, what you do is add a extension. It is the Cinemachine volume settings. Cinemachine volume settings extension. What this does is allows us to have this track a target. So now, yeah, we just need to set our look at target, and the focus, the depth of field automatically tracks our player objects. And so we can see ourselves running around the scene with a very, very shallow depth of field, blurring out almost everything unless we're essentially right beside it. Right. So that is, that's my demonstration. Thank you for coming. If there's any questions,
Awesome.
we'll start
Thanks,
answering.
Ryan.
No problem. I'll stop sharing. Yeah.
I'm sorry, Ryan, what was that?
I was just going to stop sharing the screen.
Oh, fantastic. Cool. Well, awesome. Thank you. We have a ton of questions. I actually didn't even get a chance to pay attention because I'm just feverishly typing answers to as many of these as I can. So awesome. We're going to cover as many of these as we can. So let's see here. One of the things here, is there a flag to be set so the volume effects know which is the sun or moon? So let's say you have two directional lights in a scene. There's a lot of questions about having multiple directional lights. Well, obviously, one of them tracks to your directional light if you have one, like for your sun or moon. What if you have two?
So in that case, as I demonstrated, we have a game object containing our directional light and our volumes. Your best bet is to have two separate volumes, one to control your day, one to control your night. If you want to have a Tatooine two sun situation, you can add as many directional lights as you wish. However, it's very important to disable shadows on all but your main directional light. That will cause things to go haywire. That will also show multiple suns in the physically based sky.
Cool. I think that's what they were asking about is, yeah, which one would be the suns? Because we were talking about in the chat using a second directional light as like a beauty shot to just add some like side lighting or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Perfectly valid thing to do. And yeah, that's a great way to do.
Cool. Another question here on the same line. Is it possible to add a texture to that disk that's the moon or the sun?
It is. If you add a I believe it is the surface texture it will not act as a cookie. It's not going to affect the light being cast from it. It will show that texture in the disk of the celestial lamp.
Nice. Cool. We're just firing through these. All right. So one here is there's a convert materials to HDRP, but let's say you have an HDRP material and you're in URP. Is there a convert from HDRP to URP?
No, in that scenario, your best bet is to set so the references are maintained from the standard and standard specular shader setups to the HDRP lit shader. So your best bet is to set those back to standard or standard specular, whatever it happened to be originally, and then bring that into your URP project and rerun that converter to convert it to URP. That's the only real difference between the standard and standard specular setup. In practice, under the hood, there's more to it, is simply the shader being selected. There is not a lot of difference between the properties as far as textures go and settings go. So you can oftentimes just switch the shader from standard for you.
Cool. One of the things that you had hinted on, you kind of talked about a little bit, but maybe if we can get just a slight bit more information, the difference between controlling exposure through aperture, shutter speed, and ISO within Unity.
So in photography, we have something called the exposure triangle. These values, they all affect how much light is being shown in the image. So you have your aperture, which is the diameter of the lens, so that allows the smaller the value for your aperture, the more light is allowed into your lens. That makes the depth of field more shallow. ISO, the higher the value, the more light is allowed onto your sensor. at the cost of graininess. Now, because there is no such thing as film in the case of Unity or HDRP, that does not really have that effect. That only controls how much light comes into your image. You can control the graininess by adding a film grain override, but we didn't really use that. That does not show up very well on Zoom, so I omitted that from this demo. Shutter speed is the speed at which your shutter, your frames of film roll across your shutter in a film camera. Typically, you want to set that to, I believe the value is 180 degrees. So you have a convincing motion blur. But because we weren't really using motion blur in this particular one, we were using the default values. That didn't really work.
Cool. So maybe just a quick summary: aperture, if you wanted to affect things like your depth of field and stuff like that; shutter speed, if you wanted to affect your motion blur and stuff like that; and then ISO, if you don't want to affect those two, you just want to control exposure.
Exactly.
Nice. All right. So another question here is, this is a bit more open-ended: is baked lighting important in HDRP? Is real time good enough if just slower?
So yes, real time is good enough for a lot of cases. It is an aesthetic choice. It is not as pronounced as baked lighting. So what you saw with the deep green hue cast by that plant is a little bit more subtle. So in the case of real time, of course, if you move objects around, you have the ambient lighting casting onto other objects. So it's really up to what you're trying to achieve. If it's a static scene like that one, baked lighting has like the performance advantage and the aesthetic advantage. But if, for example, you had a television that was emitting light into your scene and you wanted it to flicker around the room, you would also want to use real time.
Cool. Kind of on the same note there, do we have a real-time GI without probes, screen space, or any other kind?
So there are several options. We have Enlighten for real-time global illumination. That is enabled in the lighting panel. We also have screen space global illumination, both with and without ray tracing. That is available in the latest version of HDRP. Ray tracing is only available in the DirectX 12 renderer, and can be enabled, though ray tracing does have a significant performance cost. It can easily have your frame rate by adding one effect. So it's very dependent on what exactly you're building.
Cool. How performant are reflection probes, and are there any good tips for using them in an optimized way?
So reflection probes have a minimal impact on performance if they are not real time. So you can use them quite liberally in your scenes. You can use a reflection probe proxy volume to combine the projection of reflection probes. That's a really good way to more finely control the exact perspective from the reflections. Again, ray tracing reflections is available in DirectX 12. The performance cost is significant and considerably more than reflection probes. Real-time reflection probes are an option, sort of as a way to avoid having to use ray tracing. They are quite expensive. They generate a cube map every frame. You can also control that through scripting if you want. So you can sort of reduce the performance cost. And then planar reflection probes are another option, though those are only really suitable for flat surfaces, such as mirrors. Thinking like the newer Hitman games, the mirrors that NPCs can see from. They work by essentially using a camera to reproject what the camera sees onto the surface.
Cool. So let's try to knock out 3 questions at once here, because these are going to be a combo. So one, someone asked if they could have you reshare the screen and just see the scene again with the original camera, just so they could take a look at it, because keep it on there longer. The second is, how did you get those J.J. Abrams style lens flares on the lamppost lights? And then third is that someone noticed you changing settings while you were in play mode, and that they were saved even when you exited play mode. So could you talk about which ones of those and why?
Certainly. So our directional light, the J.J. Abrams style lens flare, isn't so there are two questions here. The lens flare that we see here on the directional light is what I imagine the J.J. Abrams lens flare to look like. That is the SRP lens flare, the anamorphic sci-fi lens right there. That comes from the package manager high definition render pipeline lens flare samples. So if you import that, you will have all of these lens flares that you can choose from. The fog on these lights here, so I just select that light, so this is just the effect that the volumetric fog has on lights in the scene. We can enable and disable the volumetrics to demonstrate how that works, and we can control the intensity of that through this slider. One is a pretty good value. However, there is a custom post-processing effect that you can use to give this style, the directional light style of J.J. Abrams lens flare to every light in your scene. That's something that I will ask to be included in the email that we send out after the fact. The other question was about how in play mode our values are saved. So the way that the volume system works in HDRP as well as in URP is that it creates an asset, this sky and fog volume settings file, in your project. This is a scriptable object essentially, and any changes that you make to it in play mode are saved directly in that object. So it transfers onto the scene. So yeah, this is just endemic to how HDRP's volume system works. So this is something you get by default.
Awesome. All right, we got 1 minute left. We still have 12 questions. Let's maybe pick a good one here and let's wrap it up there. Let's see here. Quick tips for lighting large scale interior spaces.
So whenever possible, use point lights, spotlights over point lights. They are less expensive. A point light is essentially creating 6 textures, up, down, side to side. The other thing is to, if it's possible, bake them. Again, it will be more performant, and only turn on shadows on lights that you actually need. Shadows can become very expensive, even using the deferred tile renderer of HDRP. And although it can be controlled, the number of allowed shadows, it is something that you would want to certainly keep in mind. The other thing that you can do is you have this fade distance setting. By default, all lights are set to 10,000 meters by which they fade, but if you control this down, we can set it down to 1. This light will only show when it's within one meter. So I'll set that actually to 10 to make it a little bit more reasonable, but if we go out, so now you can see we're beyond 10 meters, we no longer see that light. We only see it as like a little effect. And as we get closer, it turns on. So you're definitely going to want to use this to only show the lights within the area that you can see them. If that makes sense.
Awesome. Okay, well, we are at time. So I'd like to thank our presenter, Ryan. Thank you very much. And thanks to everyone who came out today. That was awesome. If you'd like to rewatch the sessions, we will be sending out a recording that you can keep and also share with your peers in the next few days here. If you'd like to learn more about the team and the services that Accelerate Solutions team offers, my colleagues have included a link again in chat there. That was probably getting washed away with everyone type in there. So we'll see. Along with a link to our HDRP definitive guide ebooks. If you haven't seen these ebooks, they're awesome. We also just launched a URP one, which is super cool. So if you'd like to read more on HDRP, definitely check that out. Again, thanks everyone for joining. Have an amazing day, and this concludes our webinar. So thank you.